Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue the D4 opening series with the Budapest Gambit, also known as the Budapest Defense, but it's a pawn gambit, so I think the Budapest Gambit is more appropriate. Same as with the Albin counter gambit, this is only going to be one video, and in one video I'm going to go over all the main ideas, plans for both sides, as well as the variations, which are important. So we are going to go over concepts and theory in one video. So we are going to be talking about this position you can see on the board, which is the aggressive Budapest Gambit. So how do we get to this position? Well, after white plays d4, black continues knight f6, and now after c4, well, e6 is the most common move. You can play b6, you can play g6, you can play c5, you can play d6, you can play c6. There are a million moves. So basically all of these are moves which are fairly common. Even knight c6 can be played. But we are looking at pawn to e5, and with this aggressive pawn move, black is provoking white into doing something about his center. If white captures the pawn, then he no longer has central control he used to have, because as soon as d takes e5 happens, there is no longer control over the e5 and the c5 squares, which are extremely important. Okay, if white chooses to do something else, then he's simply conceding to be equal or even slightly worse. For example, pawn to e3, just e takes d4, e takes d4, and d5, and black is perfectly fine for the rest of the game. This is simply easy for black to equalize in. Or, for example, if pawn to d5 is played, then something like bishop to c5, knight to c3 and d6, and again black has developed his pieces very sensibly. In fact, he's not even down in development after something like e4 is played. You now have a check Benoni type of position in which instead of a pawn on c5 the bishop is on c5, so perfectly sensible development. So against the Budapest Gambit, white really should take this pawn. Now, one thing that should be noted is that this pawn is going to be recaptured in most lines. It's highly unlikely that white is going to keep that pawn. So first of all, it's not a true gambit. In fact, if black is almost certain that he is getting the pawn back, well, then there are only the upsides. The first upside I can think of is people with white normally don't know a lot of theory in the Budapest. Especially in tournament games, in serious chess, you don't see this very often. The second upside is, well, if you manage to regain the pawn and disrupt white's central control, then you're gaining something. In exchange for that, white, of course, chases your knight around the board. So before we get into the opening, let me just tell you a bit about the Budapest Gambit. The first thing is, it scores kind of well if you want a fighting defense. 28% black wins, 44% of the games are won by white, and 27% draws. Now this last fact is very important. 27% draws in serious master games is fairly little for a defense, and that means that this is a fighting opening. Okay, the first ever played game, which is known, was played by Adler against Giza Maroksi in Budapest in 1896, and of course Adler is the person who got the Adler variation named after him. But the opening is more known for a very nice game played a bit later on in 1918 against Milan Vidmar, who played it with the black pieces against Akiba Rubinstein. And of course Akiba Rubinstein is one of the greatest players of the early 20th century. He was playing the white pieces, Vidmar surprised him and absolutely destroyed him. I'm actually going to show you that game at the end of the video. And funnily enough, Rubinstein got the main line named after him because of the game he had lost. Well, okay, now what can black do? First of all, there are two options with this knight. You never really go back to g8. In that case, you don't have any compensation. Also, if you play knight h5, then the simple e4 would give white a huge advantage. Your knight is attacked and you have nowhere to retreat it to. You'd have to play g6. So the only two viable options are knight e4 and knight g4. Knight g4 is the main line. And this move attacks the e5 pawn, and in all cases this pawn is going to be returned. So this is what we are going to be focusing on the most. The alternative to that is the Fajarowicz variation, which is knight e4, which doesn't seek to get the pawn back, but instead seeks to complicate things and seeks to get aggressive play very early on. One player who I know plays this is Simon Williams, the Ginger GM. I've seen him play this at least 10 times, I'm going to say, in his videos. So this is the most aggressive option. All right, now let's get into the theory. After d takes e5, knight g4, which is the main move, white gets to choose between five options, but one of them is really something that should be discarded, and that's knight h3. This move I just don't want to talk about a lot. It's a weird move which misplaces your knight. The knight is coming to f4, but I think it's too much of a time waste. So the moves that we are going to be focusing on are bishop f4, the Rubinstein variation, which is the main line. This move seeks to defend the pawn for the moment and develop the bishop before playing e3, because you are going to be playing pawn to e3 to develop your f1 bishop. So this is the most sensible and the most popular. The second most popular is the Adler variation, knight to f3, which also defends the pawn, but allows some annoying pressure after bishop to c5, where you are forced to play pawn to e3, and your bishop, as you can see, is stuck behind this pawn. Okay, to continue this, the most popular moves, we have pawn to e4, which is the Alekhine or the Alekhine variation, which is very provocative, sort of in Alekhine style, because after white gives this pawn back, he can then expand with pawn to f4, and the knight ends up back on c6 or on c6, making it harder to develop the b8 knight. And white gets a lot of play with his pawns. I mean, these pawns are controlling a ton of important squares. And finally, instead of bishop f4 or knight f3 or e4, white can also play pawn to e3. Well, this doesn't even have a name, and it blocks in the c1 bishop, gives back the pawn, so this is something I want to talk about, but I don't want to be spending too much time on this. First, I'm going to show you the typical plans in the opening, and then we are going to go through the theory. So let me just put something on the board. Let's get into the Rubinstein. So pawn to d4. Knight to f6, pawn to c4, pawn to e5 takes, knight g4, and bishop f4. Now, this, as I said, is the most popular because it's very sensible to develop your bishop before blocking it in. Again, I said that the Rubinstein variation is named after the game Rubinstein Vidmar, which we are going to see. And most people today consider bishop f4 the strongest option. So one thing that I would like to talk about first is the Budapest Rook, and the reason why I chose this variation is because it avoids it. So for example, if you continue with knight to f3, okay, knight to f3, you are at risk of accepting the Budapest Rook. So for example, okay, bishop to c5, which is the main move, pawn to e3, knight to c6. We are going to go through the theory in a second. I just want to show you the main patterns. Bishop to e2, knight takes the pawn back, takes, white castles, and black, for example, plays pawn to a5, and after knight c3 he plays rook to a6. This is the Budapest Rook. This is the most famous attacking piece in the Budapest Gambit, and in most cases when black is able to do this, he's going to do this. And this rook switching across to h6 or to g6 can be a menacing piece. Now, returning to the Rubinstein, while in the Adler variation with knight to f3, black has the option to play the Budapest Rook maneuver. The bishop f4, that's very rarely the case, because this bishop is well placed to protect the king side. So in the event of something similar happening, now these are not normal moves, I'll just play pawn to a5 immediately and rook a6. You can see that if this rook gets anywhere close to the king side, then firstly this bishop is controlling h6, secondly this bishop can simply drop back to g3, and this Budapest Rook is not a problem. So that's a very key point in the Budapest Gambit. So the Budapest Rook is something you have to look out for as white, as black. It can be played always if white hasn't played the Rubinstein with bishop to f4. So especially in the Adler variation with knight to f3, this is something you basically play for. After bishop c5, e3 is forced, and now you're going to develop your pieces, castle, and then you go for a5, rook a6, and chaos on the board. So that's what the Budapest Gambit players want. Excuse me. The next point I would like to discuss is this idea of developing the bishop with tempo to b4. This is, I would say, the second most important strategic concept in the Budapest Gambit. By playing this move pawn to e5 very early on, you give yourself the option to develop your bishop quickly, basically whatever white does. And in most variations, black has this opportunity. So white has three possible answers to this move, bishop to b4. If I'll just play it now, so that, okay, let's say here, and I'll just play it now. This is not a theoretical move, I just want to show you the patterns. White has three options: knight c3, knight d2, or bishop d2. Now, if knight c3 is played, which is seldom played, this pawn structure is absolutely horrendous for white. And what black is trying to achieve here, and I'll just play stupid moves for white. Let's say b6, let's say bishop b7, let's say knight to c6, and knight here. You put pressure on this pawn, you blockade it. You can also play c5 if you want to, or you can simply try to mount pressure on it by playing bishop a6 instead of bishop to b7. So this is something we've seen in the Nimzo-Indian defense, and it's very common. Now let me show you how this can happen in a normal position. So after knight g4, we have bishop f4, for example, the Rubinstein, bishop b4 check. Okay, so now knight c3 again can be simply met with bishop c3, b3, and we go for the same thing. It's therefore not advisable to play knight to c3. Now, white's most common move is knight to d2. You may think, well, what has black achieved? Firstly, black has developed his bishop with tempo, so that's good. Secondly, this knight doesn't want to be on d2. Why? Because it wants to control d5. So this knight's natural square is the c3 square, and having to move it to d2 is already a concession. It's not a big concession, but it's a concession. So for example, after knight to d2 you don't want to take. You continue with something like d6, e d6, queen f6, and you can see there's already trouble on the queen side because the bishop has moved. Finally, well, one thing I would like to talk about here after knight to d2, often it's a question whether this bishop is worse than the knight, because the bishop is arguably also misplaced. It would much rather like to be on c5 or even on e7. But both pieces are compromised, and black gets to develop his king side quicker. Finally, the move bishop to d2, which in this position is not a good move, of course, but also has to be discussed. If white has to play bishop to d2, then black should trade these pieces, this piece trade that white has offered, only if white is forced to recapture with the knight, so misplacing the knight back to d2, because if the queen takes on d2, then the knight can again go to its most natural square. So also one thing I would like to mention, if the queen has already moved to, let's say, c2, b3, or a4, then taking is okay. Also, if the queen is on c2, even if you take the bishop, if the queen takes, it has wasted the tempo. But the most important thing to note is that you are looking for this bishop b4 check to develop rapidly and then to cause some havoc in the black position. Okay, let's move on. One other thing I would like to mention is what white is trying to do in the Budapest Gambit. So, as it's usually the case with most aggressive openings, the side that plays the gambit, the side that plays the aggressive opening, wants to attack. And usually the other side tries to survive and then win because of the compensation it gets. In the Budapest Gambit, this situation is quite drastic. After e5, d5, knight g4, Again, let's use the Rubinstein, knight c6. This is the main line. We are going to go over the theory. I'm just showing you the plans. Bishop b4 check, knight b to d2, queen e7 is the main move, a3 is one of the main moves. And yeah, in this position, before we continue, I'm just going to show you one trap, which I would like to discuss before we get into the theory so that you can keep an eye out on that. This position is actually very important for the trap. It's called the Kiningar Trap. And I'll just show you all the moves from start to finish. So d4, knight f6, c4, e5, d5, knight g4, Rubinstein, knight c6, knight f3, bishop b4, knight bd2, queen e7. We've seen this, and pawn to a3. Okay, in this position, Black's most theoretical move is knight g takes e5. Now, what can white do? Well, this bishop is hanging. Why isn't black moving the bishop back? You may be wondering. Well, in this position, the bishop actually doesn't have to go back because you can gain a tempo on the white king by playing knight takes on e5. Now, in the case of this bishop being taken, a takes b4, then knight to d3 is checkmate. This you've seen in reverse in the Karpov-Caro-Kann, where white plays queen e2 and checkmates in similar fashion. So this would be checkmate. So after knight g takes e5, white cannot take the bishop. He has to take the knight. And now after knight takes e5 again, in this position, if you take the bishop again, knight to d3 is again checkmate. So white has to play e3. And only now that the king was given an escape square on e2, now the bishop is actually under attack. So now you're forced to take, and queen takes. So this is the Kiningar Trap, which you absolutely have to remember because it's in one of the main lines. Now let's return to the same position, having explained the Kiningar Trap. Black doesn't have to move the bishop away. Black can play knight g takes e5, and we've seen knight e5, knight e5, e3, bishop to d2, queen takes d2. Fine. So what has happened so far? White got the bishop pair and the big space advantage. This is a big space advantage. Why? Because black has 7 pawns on their starting squares and white is already expanding. The most common plan for white is to attack this clump of 4 pawns black has on the queen side with his 3 pawns. And usually white does that by pushing c5. And this is something you absolutely have to know with both sides. c5 is what white is trying to do. So black is often going to play d6 and b6, or just d6, but it's very common to play both to prevent that. So I'll just show you what happens. If white can safely play c5 without being challenged, it improves the light squared bishop. Obviously, this bishop wants to get to c4. It creates more pressure on the black position because the white rooks are able to infiltrate via the 4th rank, which seems unlikely, but can actually happen because the pieces have been reduced to almost nothing. And it creates, often, if white manages to push this pawn through while the pawn is on d6 and exchange, it creates a backwards pawn for black on d6. So let's see what black does against that. Now, a fairly natural move like castles is already a huge mistake because of c5. And this went uncontested. If black plays d6 now, then we exchange. And this is, of course, not good. So against this in the main line, you play d6 to prevent c5. Now, white can force through c5 anyway, and it's important to know how to deal with this. So bishop e2, for example, castles, white castles. Now I would recommend the move b6 because it stops c5 by brute force, and bishop b7 is a nice move to make. But white continues b4, bishop b7, and now you may be thinking, well, c5 is defended against, but no, c5 anyway. And this is tricky. You play d takes c5, and after b takes c5, you don't want to take. You play rook f to d8, for example. You continue developing. If you play queen takes c5, then any rook to c1, for example, rook f to c1, queen e7, and something like queen c3 is already a ton of pressure on both pieces. So this is already very tricky for white to defend. If after bc5 you take bc5, then simply rook ac1 picks up the pawn, and your pawns are absolutely horrific. So you have to continue with rook f to d8. So this plan of pushing forward with c5, b4, c5, and going for a minority attack is very common. In any case, white is going to create some weaknesses in the black position. And even if, for example, in this position, let's say queen to c3, and now the common move is rook to d5. Now white continues weakening the structure. cb6, ab6, you have a pawn on c7 which needs to be pushed. If it's forced to be pushed, if it cannot be defended sufficiently, for example, rook fc1, if it cannot be defended sufficiently, then you have a weakness on b6. So it's a tricky position. So c5 is something you have to remember. Now finally, let's get onto the theory. The first variation we are going to be looking at is the sideline with Ne4, the Fajarowicz variation. It's thought to be, well, conceived in Leipzig. It originated in Leipzig, and the first important game is Steiner-Fajarowicz in 1928, so quite recent compared to the main Budapest Gambit. And black doesn't care about the pawn in the Fajarowicz. He goes for a quick attack and tactical tricks. And okay, so now the move knight f3 is the main line, but most people consider pawn to a3 to be the best. Why? Because it prevents this annoying bishop b4. One other thing that can be played is knight to d2. So let's have a look at this position. If knight to d2, this is the safest move because it tries to, well, rid black of his attacking pieces. And for example, after something like knight c5, knight f3, knight c6, g3, white has a very safe position. These pieces have been driven away from the attack. So if you want to play it safely, if you don't know what you're doing, I would recommend playing knight b to d2, because there really is no problem for white in this case. The only problem is that the knight is not on c3, but that's okay. So the move a3 alternatively is considered to be the best because it prevents, it simply prevents bishop b4. It also prepares b4 c5, remember that. So black's best continuation, along with d6, which is the main line, and something like knight f3, knight c6, is to play b6, which fights against c5 straight away. And now, for example, knight to f3, bishop to b7, knight b to d2, a5 can be played to stop b4, knight e4, bishop e4. Again, black is still a pawn down, but he has a sensible position. Bishop c5 is a move he can make. He can undermine the structure with d6 and, well, make it a true pawn gambit. And in the main line after knight f3, which white chooses, then black gets to play bishop b4 check, knight b to d2, and knight c6 normal development, a3. You take with the knight, of course, and after bishop takes d2, queen takes d2, queen e7, you are preparing to regain the pawn. White can be slightly stubborn, but after b6, e3, bishop b7, bishop e2, castles queenside, you have attacking compensation. Now, in my opinion, it's not that good to play knight e4 instead of knight g4, which are the main lines, because if white knows what he's doing, he's going to have an extra pawn and survive. And in fact, in this case, castling kingside would be risky, but white can just castle queenside, and there are no issues here. Everything is secure. I want to be white, I have an extra pawn on e5. So that's the Fajarowicz variation. Now let's have a look at the sidelines after knight g4. After d4, knight f6, c4, e5, knight d takes e5, knight g4. The least common variation is pawn to e3, and this I would immediately discard for white if you're preparing for serious chess, because this gives the pawn back and blocks the bishop in. So knight takes e5. And the idea is, because you've played e3, similar to that move knight h3 that we saw previously, that you want to play knight f4. But after bishop b4 check, bishop to d2, you now basically have to exchange. You have no other way to play this position. Bishop takes d2. In fact, queen takes d2 is played in this case, not knight takes, because you don't want your knight on d2, you want it on c3. d6, knight f4, castles. This knight looks okay, but I honestly don't think that white has any advantage here. Knight b to d7, knight c3, you can play a5. White castles, knight c5. These knights look great, they cannot be driven away easily. For example, rook a d1, rook e8, b3. White doesn't have anything here, so e3 I would discard. Now let's continue with the Alekhine variation. Pawn to e4. It's named after Alkine because he won twice with it. Alekhine Rubinstein in 1925 and Alekhine Zitz in 1926 in Hastings. And here for white the idea is fairly simple. Instead of trying to defend the pawn, you just go for a quick attack and try to expand. So black has nothing better but to take. White plays f4. The knight has to drop back, and now bishop to e3 is the most aggressive. You could also play knight f3, allowing bishop c5, but if you play bishop e3 first, then bishop c5 is impossible. So black has to play bishop b4 check, knight to d2 without blocking in the bishop. That's important. So bishop e3 is the best. Queen e7, trying to take this pawn because the knight is pinned. Bishop d3 defense, and now black usually goes for knight a6 because it's very hard to develop the knight otherwise. Queen e2 defends everything, knight c5 challenges the d3 bishop, and white castles queenside. And after knight d3, queen d3, well, the material is equal, white is the one playing aggressively, so if you want to turn the tables and bring on the heat to the Gambit player, then play the Alekhine variation. As I said, I'm not a big fan, but it's a viable option. It's definitely the most aggressive option. Arguably one of the worst, but the most aggressive one, definitely. Of course, if black castles kingside, then stuff is coming towards the king. So it would be best to continue with something like b6 and bishop b7. And in fact, even trading pieces with bishop c5 could be good. Okay, now the Adler variation, knight f3. Now, well, knight f3, okay, firstly, it's called after Adler. I already said that Adler Maroczy, and white is ready to give back the pawn in most cases because he has the d5 square for the knight on b1, which is, well, something he would like to do, and in this variation he can safely do that. He can keep his lovely knight on f3, and he can develop his bishop to b2. So that's basically the plan. He wants to just develop his kingside quickly and play sensible moves without developing this bishop first or defending the pawn. Black can do two things. He can play bishop c5 or knight c6. Bishop c5 is by far more common. Knight c6 just transposes to the Rubinstein after bishop f4 because white doesn't have anything better. So bishop c5 and pawn to e3. So provoking pawn to e3. This bishop is hemmed in, but the bishop did not come to b4, so the knight can sensibly come to c3 and to d5, and this bishop can come to b2 later on after b3. So there's a lot to be said about the Adler. But remember what black is trying to do. He's trying to go for the Budapest Rook. Knight c6 now, bishop e2 develops, both sides castle. Rook e8 attacks the pawn, and white is going to give the pawn back. There's no doubt about it. Playing bishop b4, I should have already mentioned that instead of, for example, knight c6 here would be, well, a waste of tempo because you've moved the bishop twice. So rook e8, knight c3, same here, of course. So knight g takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, white plays b3, trying to, well, develop his bishop, normal, and black plays a5. So I would say that the Adler variation allows a lot more activity for black and allows for black to play what he's trying to do, to play the Budapest Rook, Budapest Gambit thematic attack. So a5 is the start of that. Of course, this gives up the b5 square for the moment, but your pawn is still on c7. So, okay, bishop b2, rook a6. And now the most common way to play is knight e4. The reason is twofold. Firstly, we gain a tempo on the bishop. Secondly, your knight can come to g3, which is very often the crucial defensive piece. And it's often said that if you have your knight on f1 or on f8, then you cannot get checkmated. Well, the g3 knight can easily come to f1 if need be to defend the h2 square. So basically, by bringing this knight over to the king side, white is securing himself. Okay, bishop a7, the normal retreating move. And now white has one a very aggressive option in this position, and that's to play queen to d5. The alternatives are knight g3 immediately, c5, blocking in the bishop. They're all viable, but queen d5 is the main move. Simply preparing to, well, after rook h6 is played, preparing to take a piece. So this was actually an attack on the knight. It's not easy to defend this knight, and if you play d6, why did you play rook a6? He could simply play c5, and so for example, if d6 then c5, and you just lose. So after queen d5, there's a tricky variation that you have to know. So you play rook h6 anyway. You could play rook e6, but that's not as common. Rook h6, and now this is a piece sacrifice, but it's a temporary piece sacrifice. Bishop e5. You play c6. The queen cannot keep defending the bishop, so if the queen just drops back, then simply rook takes bishop, and okay, for the moment the bishop is here, but you can see what's happening, for example. So after c6, white has to play bishop f6, a counterattack. So if you take, I take, and now we have to take with the g pawn. And in this position, queen d3, the queen drops back, and you continue with d5. So this, on the plus side, has opened up the g file. On the downside for black, it's ruined the kingside pawn structure. So it's highly likely it's going to be a draw. White defends with knight g3 and something like rook e5, and chaos is starting. So black has the two bishops, black has a ruined pawn structure, but already has two major pieces next to the white king. So this is nice. I think this is nice for black. At least it's what black wants. Okay, and finally the Rubinstein variation, which is the main line. Okay, something's happened here. Okay. Whoa. Okay, the Rubinstein. Sometimes Lichess studies change main lines for no reason when you switch chapters. Okay, so bishop f4. As we said, the idea is to develop the bishop before playing e3 and to temporarily defend the e5 pawn. Black has two options, well, three options actually. Let's have a look at bishop b4 check sideline first. After knight d2, d6. That's avoiding knight c6 basically. E takes d6, queen f6, and we've seen this before, trying to put pressure on b2. So e3, queen takes b2, knight f3, and bishop f5, and trying to, well, complicate matters. After something like a3, chasing the bishop away, bishop c3. This gets quite tricky, and you can play rook c1 here to defend, and black is basically going on all in, but I wouldn't recommend this line. The other option after bishop f4, which is also aggressive but completely unsound, is g5. Now, completely unsound may be too hard. This has been played by Shakhriyar Mamedyarov at Badr Jabava, so it's not a bad move, but it weakens a lot of squares. The idea behind g5 is basically to chase the bishop away. You can drop back to d2, but then knight takes e5, and after something like knight f3, you can simply play bishop g7, and black in fact does get quick development. But bishop g3 is far more common, and now bishop g7, knight f3 defends the pawn again, knight c6 attacks the pawn again, and after knight c3, black simply regains the lost e5 pawn, having chased this bishop away and weakened his king. So you could play g5, but I honestly think the main line is better, and that there's no reason to weaken yourself, because even though it's the Budapest Gambit and it's supposed to be aggressive, you can play solidly and get your pawn back and still have something. So we are going to be looking at knight c6, and since we've already seen this position quite a lot, knight f3, bishop b4, knight bd2, bishop e7, remember that this a3 move leads to the trap if you're not careful, the Kiningar Trap. So in this position as white, just remember that after knight g5 you're not supposed to take the bishop, but knight e5, pawn to e3. Now remember that minority attack idea for white. For black, remember that you have to keep things together with d6, b6, bishop b7, and try to, well, survive the minority attack. But the main move after queen e7 is not a3, it's e3. And this is kind of sensible because there are no trap tricks on d3. So black just gets his pawn back. Knight takes e5, knight takes e5, white develops bishop e2. Black castles, white castles. And now, well, basically, as soon as white castles, this bishop is kind of loose. And if you don't do anything, white will play a3, b4, chase the bishop around the board, and force you to take the knight. So it's very common to just voluntarily give up your bishop for the d2 knight. And the main line actually goes bishop takes d2, and after queen takes d2, it's supposed to be almost equal. d6, b4, white starts the undermining process, rook to d8, queen to c3, preparing c5, a5, undermining the pawn, c5 anyway, and queen f6. So white wants to just destroy black's queen side, and black has to live with that. And the alternative to that, which I find quite interesting, although it's sort of time-consuming, is to play knight g6, gain a tempo on the bishop, and after the bishop drops back, you trade off your bishop for his by playing bishop to d6. And after bishop takes, queen takes, the downside is, well, firstly, c5 could come with tempo, knight e4 comes with tempo, and you have to move your queen again. And only after, let's say, knight c3 can you play d6. So you've wasted a bit of time, but this should be perfectly equal. Again, there is no attack. So white has managed to sort of calm down the gambit. And white has a plan to go for this minority attack. Black, if he manages to prevent the minority attack, he is good and the position is equal. If white succeeds, white is better. So I'm sorry to say that the Budapest Gambit comes down to positional stuff, but that's my conclusion of the opening after having studied it. And I think that it's more of a positional opening than a tactical opening. And that's good. It could be tactical, it could be positional, so it's good for your development. Again, my conclusion, a good opening for black, a good opening choice. A great surprise factor about the opening, and well, white's options are not that broad, and you can learn how to deal with each of them. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.